This story takes place in Saskatchewan, one of Canada's prairie provinces. A vast stretch of farmland, grain, and open sky in the western half of the country. 70 kilometers north of Saskatoon, the province's largest city, sat a small farming village where the Hoffman family lived. Robert Hoffman was German. His wife Stella was Ukrainian. Devout Lutherans, they ran a mixed farm, hay and cattle, and raised 7 children. They were hard-working, respected in their community, the kind of family that kept Sunday as a holy day and rarely missed church. Their 5th child, Victor Ernest Hoffman, was born in 1946. As a young boy, he seemed entirely ordinary, shy, a little reclusive, but he hit his milestones on schedule and had at least one close friend. Around the time he started school, something began to shift. Victor would later describe seeing what he believed was the devil for the first time. A pitch-black, 6-foot creature, naked, with a long tail. He described hearing tapping sounds at night, a drumming that built faster and faster, and a persistent feeling that he was caught in the middle of a battle between God and the devil. As these experiences intensified, Victor's schoolwork suffered. He repeated grade 3. Around age 10, he began experiencing something far more alarming, near daily urges to kill. When he met someone new, his first instinct was often an impulse toward violence. He told no one, not because he was hiding it skillfully necessarily, but because his parents, managing a farm and 7 children, simply didn't notice. He began directing these impulses at animals. It started with a cat caught accidentally in a trap. He progressed to hunting and killing cats deliberately, then dogs, then whatever else he could catch. He later said he had killed several hundred squirrels. On at least one occasion, he violently attacked a young boy and threatened him into silence. The boy never told. Despite all of this, Victor was, by his father's account, a genuinely capable young man, good with his hands, skilled at fixing bicycles for neighborhood kids, a real asset on the farm, particularly when it came to solving the practical problems that came up during planting season. He had hidden the deterioration happening inside him exceptionally well. His psychosis, meanwhile, seemed to feed directly off the strict religious environment he'd grown up in. He described one specific incident over breakfast when he heard the devil calling him outside. He went out and saw a roughly 6.5-foot creature, stocky, with a pig-like appearance, who told Victor he could make him rich if Victor knelt before him. Victor refused to fully bow, compromising by kneeling on one knee, hoping for half the promised riches instead. When the riches never materialized, he decided it was because he hadn't bowed correctly. This was one of roughly 20 occasions on which Victor reported seeing the devil. Soon after, he began seeing angels as well, typically appearing as women, speaking to him the way the devil did. His internal world became an ongoing battle between these two forces, with Victor caught in the middle, sometimes grabbing weapons under the belief he was defending one side against the other. Victor repeated grade 9 and began missing school entirely. His parents weren't particularly alarmed. When the school principal called them in, their understanding was that he'd told them Victor had caused no real trouble up to that point. But outside school hours, a different pattern was emerging. An escalating obsession with firearms. At 15, Victor broke into a store in the nearby town of Leask and stole guns. He later said the tapping sounds in his head returned afterward and persisted for weeks, like some kind of supernatural code trying to reach him. He wasn't caught that time. More than a year later, he broke into the same store again. This time, neighbors identified him and turned him in. 17-year-old Victor spent 24 hours in jail and received a 2-year suspended sentence. As he moved into his 20s, things deteriorated further. He began fainting and having fits. The devil's visits intensified. with the figure pressuring him to sell his soul, threatening, in Victor's account, that he would die 1,000,000 deaths if he refused. He came to believe God and the angels wanted him to kill the devil, and that doing so would earn him entry to heaven. He described once capturing the devil but having to release it immediately due to its overwhelming smell. Another time he tried, unsuccessfully, to shoot it. Yet another time he caught it in a net, only to feel betrayed when the angels failed to deliver on their promise of heaven. He recalled at one point something resembling a martial arts confrontation with the creature. By 21, Victor's family had finally begun to recognize that something was seriously wrong. He cycled between withdrawn silence, sudden explosive rage, and bouts of senseless laughter. On the morning of May 27, 1967, Victor walked into the hayfield and began firing his rifle wildly into the air. His mother, Stella, ran toward him, asking for the gun. He told her, "I shot the devil." She managed to take the rifle from him and put it away. Victor then announced he felt sick from a chemical used on the crops and drove off in his car. While he was gone, his frightened family gathered every firearm in the house and hid them. When Victor returned and couldn't find the guns, he demanded they be handed over. His family refused. He said no one would get hurt and asked to speak with the family's pastor, who was called immediately. Stella tried to listen in on the conversation but could only make out one fragment as the pastor was leaving, Victor saying, "I'd like to kill Mom." His father, Robert, would later say simply, "That poor guy. I guess he called for help. I guess he didn't know which way to turn." The family arranged for Victor to be committed to the Saskatchewan hospital in North Battleford. A psychiatrist there diagnosed him as schizoid, in a state of acute schizophrenic reaction, and recommended hospitalization. Victor, likely relieved, checked himself involuntarily. Hospital records described him as physically unwell alongside his psychiatric symptoms, stomach cramps and burning sensations, likely from prolonged exposure to harsh farming chemicals. He was in every sense a young man in crisis. Staff described him during evaluation as cooperative but withdrawn, vague, and indifferent, requiring prompting to elaborate on answers. He eventually disclosed his hallucinations, the pig-faced devil, the angels, and complained that his siblings had laughed when he'd mentioned seeing the devil. He told doctors he now wondered whether he was male or female, believing the devil had replaced his brain with that of a girl named Denise, who he feared was trying to take over his body. He was diagnosed with chronic schizophrenia, resulting in severe and largely uncontrolled symptoms. His treatment followed the standard approach of the era: antipsychotic medication, talk therapy, and a course of 12 electroconvulsive therapy sessions. By the second session, Victor showed some improvement, more pleasant, less withdrawn, though still delusional. By the fifth, he was more cooperative and sociable, and even conceded that the devil might have existed only in his mind, though he maintained he had magical powers. After the ninth, little additional change was noted, though his father felt he seemed more like himself. After the 12th and final session, Victor expressed doubt about the devil and angel experiences, but still believed the devil occasionally visited him, and said that if discharged, he intended to try to catch and destroy it. Within days, he shifted again, declaring that he now believed none of it had been real. He became more cooperative and pleasant overall, though periods of withdrawal persisted. Even believing himself free of the devil, he admitted he still thought sometimes about killing, imagining his brothers dead, imagining killing his parents, his sisters, his school friends. He later told psychiatrists he held no hatred toward any of them and had no actual reason to want them dead. He just wanted to. After a month in hospital, the psychiatrist met with Robert Hoffman and explained that Victor was schizophrenic but not severely so. Robert, not fully understanding the clinical weight of the term, asked how long recovery would take. The psychiatrist told him, "Maybe a year or two, and he'll be as good as ever." Victor was discharged into his father's care on July 26, 1967, with a course of tranquilizers and other medications. Victor's parents tried to manage his medication carefully. He was sleeping far more than usual, which his family took as a good sign. Rest, they assumed, would help. It didn't. Internally, something was building. From the moment he returned home, Victor had a foreboding sense that something terrible was coming. He began having what he described as prophetic visions, seeing events before they happened. He had recurring dreams, both asleep and while simply daydreaming, of killing people. He found readjusting to farm work difficult. He felt physically weak. On August 8th, almost 2 weeks after his discharge, he stopped taking his medication. He said he felt fine for the first 2 days. By the third, the foreboding feeling returned, stronger. He sensed he was heading toward either jail or another hospitalization. His father later reflected, when he came out of hospital, he said he would soon have died and go back because he couldn't stand the shock treatments. It was too much. At first, he said the treatments didn't bother him because of the state he was in. But after he began to come out of it, he began to feel the effects more. From that point on, Victor experienced daily fantasies about killing someone, anyone, possibly his brother, possibly a friend. He mentioned his thoughts to one friend who told him he didn't think Victor was the type. He continued working the farm, his mind drifting toward violent daydreams while driving the tractor. On Saturday, August 12th, a specific thought crystallized: that killing someone would demonstrate his capability to the devil and bring him closer to what he called the Black Beast. He still couldn't sleep. 2 days later, on August 14th, the intensity of the thoughts kept building. He worked the farm as usual. That night, exhausted, he managed to fall asleep on the couch until his parents woke him and sent him to bed. He couldn't get back to sleep. He went out to the garage. He saw the family dog, felt an impulse to kill it, and didn't. He puttered around for an hour, then began pacing. Then he described a strange sensation on the right side of his head, as if his entire body had been split in half, and something had left him. A powerful, overwhelming impulse to kill descended on him. He filled his car with gas, loaded his rifle, and drove off into the night. 40 miles northwest of Leask sat the small community of Shell Lake, about 250 residents in 1967, with one hotel, one cafe, one pub, and an unpaved main street. Just outside the village lived the Peterson family. James Peterson, 47, and his wife Evelyn, 42, were ordinary, church-going farmers with 9 children ranging from 1 to 19. All but the eldest, Kathy, who had recently married and moved to a logging town in British Columbia, still lived at home in a white 5-room farmhouse on 480 acres of mixed-use farmland. Their second oldest, 17-year-old Jean, was a promising athlete hoping to attend a track and field camp. To help fund it, James had planned a long day of work, moving 50 bushels of wheat to sell at the grain elevator in Shell Lake. He'd asked a neighbor to help. On the morning of August 15th, 1967, the family began waking up to start that day. At that same moment, Victor Hoffman was driving through rural Saskatchewan with his .22 rifle beside him, with no destination in mind, only the certainty that he needed to kill something. A hawk landed on a nearby pole. He considered shooting it and kept driving instead. He passed farmhouse after farmhouse, the urge growing stronger with each one. As dawn broke, he pulled into the driveway of a white farmhouse. He felt immediately that he recognized it, that he'd seen it before in one of his visions. It was 6 a.m. Inside, James and Evelyn Peterson sat on the edge of their bed, beginning their morning. Baby Larry was in his mother's arms, nursing. Tires screeched in the driveway. A car door slammed. "Who is it?" James called out. The front door burst open. 21-year-old Victor Hoffman stood in the doorway with a .22 caliber pump-action rifle. James came out of the bedroom, saw the gun, and ran toward Victor in an attempt to protect his family. Victor fired 4 shots into James's stomach. James fell to the floor. Victor stepped over his body and into the house. Screams erupted from every room. In one bedroom, 6 children huddled together. Mary, 13, Pearl, 9, Jean, 17, William, 5, Phyllis, 4, and Colin, 2. Evelyn remained in the parents' room holding the baby tightly while her husband lay dying in the kitchen. Victor fired 3 more rounds into James. He moved to where 11-year-old Dorothy was sleeping on a cot in the living room. She closed her eyes and screamed as he fired. He continued to the bedroom where the 6 children waited. One of them cried out, "Don't shoot me, I don't want to die." Victor would later describe them as not looking like people to him in that moment. He said they looked like pigs, and reasoned to himself that he had already crossed the line into murder, so there was no reason to stop. He fired into them at close range. He did not notice 4-year-old Phyllis hidden beneath the bedsheets between 2 of her sisters. In the opposite bedroom, Evelyn was trying to escape through a window with the baby. She had just made it outside when Victor heard them and moved quickly to follow. He fired 4 shots. Evelyn fell, still holding Larry. Victor turned back into the house to make sure the children's room was finished, firing several additional rounds. It was then he spotted Phyllis hiding between her sisters' bodies. He later said she had the face of an angel and decided to leave her. Back in the living room, he heard a baby crying. He went outside and found Larry still in his deceased mother's arms. Victor stood over him, thinking about what would happen to the child if left alive. Not wanting the baby to suffer, and saying afterward that he hated himself for it, he shot him too. In that moment, Victor described a feeling of déjà vu, as though he had already lived this exact scene in a dream. Panic set in. He searched for spent shell casings, shaking out blankets to find them, collecting 17 and stuffing them into his pocket. He went through the wallets in the house and took a total of $7. Then he got in his car and drove the 40 minutes home. What he left behind remains, to this day, Saskatchewan's worst mass murder. On the drive home, Victor felt physically sick. He considered shooting himself, but wasn't sure how to do it in a way that would be quick. He arrived home around 7:30 a.m. His parents, both already awake, asked where he'd been and scolded him mildly for going out so early. Victor felt confused. At the time of the shootings, his actions had felt correct to him. Now the weight of what he'd done was beginning to register, along with the certainty that he'd be in trouble. Meanwhile, the Peterson family's neighbor, who had agreed to help James move his wheat that day, arrived at the farm and got to work, expecting James to come out and join him. By 9 a.m., with no sign of James, he walked over to the house. The usual morning bustle was gone, replaced by an unsettling quiet. The family dog approached him, subdued and uncharacteristically withdrawn. At the front door, he found James Peterson's body. That was enough. The farmhouse had no telephone, so he ran to the Peterson family's station wagon and drove as fast as he could into Shell Lake to call the RCMP. Corporal Barry Richards was first on scene. He found James's body inside the entrance. then 11-year-old Dorothy on her living room cot. In one bedroom, 5-year-old William, 13-year-old Mary, and 2-year-old Colin all shot. Also 17-year-old Jean and 9-year-old Pearl. Wedged between two of them, 4-year-old Phyllis, physically unharmed, in shock, her face buried in the bedding. Richards carried Phyllis to a neighboring farmhouse for safety, then went to Shell Lake to request backup before returning with a doctor from a nearby clinic. At the back of the house, beneath an open window, they found Evelyn and baby Larry. Every victim showed powder burns consistent with close-range gunfire. Backup arrived, and the scene was processed. 9 people, dead, scattered across the house, with no immediate indication of who had done it or why. Investigators did find a few critical pieces of evidence. Distinctive bloody footprints on the linoleum, marked by a diamond pattern on the sole and a V shape on the heel, and several spent .22 caliber casings that Victor had failed to fully collect in his haste. As word spread through Shell Lake and the surrounding area, panic followed. An unknown killer had murdered an entire family, including a baby, and was still at large. That night, residents slept with their lights on and weapons within reach. Local media later called it the Night of Fear. The RCMP, under enormous pressure, launched an extensive investigation. 75 police dogs searching the area, roadblocks established, residents urged to report anything suspicious. The footprints were sent for forensic analysis in Regina. The bullet casings were traced to one of 3 possible rifle models. Many in the community struggled to believe a single person could have carried out the massacre without a single family member escaping, and speculated there must have been more than one shooter. But the local investigators, Brian Sawyer and Staff Sergeant Ronald Thondegard, disagreed. Without any formal profiling training, they noted simply that the Petersons were an unremarkable farm family with no apparent enemies, no signs of robbery, and no indication of sexual assault. Their conclusion: the killer was likely a local man with a documented history of mental illness. On August 17th, 2 days after the massacre, a farmer walked into the Shell Brook RCMP detachment and said, "My neighbor's son just got out of the mental hospital, and he likes guns and is a good hunter." He gave a name, Victor Ernest Hoffman. Officers drove immediately to the Hoffman residence. Approaching the front door, they noticed a pair of boots on the stoop, matching the distinctive print found at the crime scene. They seized them as evidence. Robert Hoffman confirmed the family owned a .22 caliber rifle, which was sent for ballistic comparison against the recovered casings. Within 24 hours, confirmation came back. The rifle matched. The boots tested positive for human blood. A search of the property turned up 2 empty wallets, both belonging to members of the Peterson family. Victor Hoffman was arrested on August 19th, 4 days after the massacre, while mowing his field. Brought in for interrogation, he confessed within 15 minutes, expressing regret only that he hadn't burned down the farmhouse afterward, reasoning that it might have destroyed the evidence. Asked whether he'd ever wanted to do something like this before, he replied, "No, just those few minutes there, it just popped into my mind, just like that." Asked if he thought he could get rid of the impulse, he said, "No, sir. I just went and done it anyway." Asked if he had anything else to add. "Just that I know I'm sick in the head, but I can never kill again. I know that." On the same day Victor was arrested, the funeral for all 9 murdered Petersons was held. Roughly 1,500 people from Shell Lake and surrounding communities gathered at God's Acre Cemetery to watch the family lowered into a mass grave. 2 members survived: Kathy, 19, living in British Columbia, and 4-year-old Phyllis. Kathy and her husband Lee brought Phyllis to British Columbia and raised her as their own. On August 21, 1967, Victor was charged with the capital slaying of James Peterson and sent to the University Psychiatric Hospital in Saskatoon for assessment. Over 2 days of interviews with Dr. Donald McCarricher, Victor offered a striking range of explanations. He blamed James Peterson directly, claiming that a calmer reaction from James in the doorway would have prevented everything. If he had stood quiet and told me I was wrong, it would have been all right. He could have helped me and I wouldn't have killed him. But he tried to stop me. He said he'd been somewhat scared while shooting James, but not sorry. He also blamed the hospital for discharging him. If I had someone to talk to, I wouldn't have committed murder. I knew when I left that I would commit murder. I feel guilty. I am scared that I'll spend the rest of my life in prison. I will never see the outside world again. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how I started to do it. My mind was blank. It was kill, kill, kill. He also blamed the devil, claiming he'd been tricked, though he couldn't explain why the Petersons specifically had been targeted. He said he wished to die. He was diagnosed as schizophrenic, but ultimately judged fit to stand trial and transferred to Prince Albert Jail to await proceedings. The court-appointed defense lawyer G.E. Noble, who had 18 years of legal experience but limited knowledge of psychiatry, he requested Victor's complete medical history and quickly recognized that Victor had been profoundly mentally ill at the time of the murders, but understood his real challenge would be persuading a jury that had grown weary of mentally ill patients being released only to commit violence. He needed to show there was more nuance to the story than that pattern alone suggested. In 1967, public understanding of schizophrenia was muddled by decades of conflicting theory, frequently mischaracterized as split personality or as an illness reflecting personal weakness, and broadly viewed as incurable. Noble deliberately avoided having Victor re-examined by the same hospital psychiatrist who had discharged him 3 weeks before the massacre, recognizing the conflict of interest involved. Instead, he sought out independent specialists in Saskatoon, including Dr. Abram Hoffer, a leading researcher in schizophrenia and co-developer of the Hoffer-Osmond diagnostic test, a structured assessment used to evaluate schizophrenic symptoms based on a patient's perception of their environment. A typical non-symptomatic score on this test fell below 20. The average schizophrenic patient scored around 65. Victor's hospital record showed a score of 65 at the time of his discharge. When Dr. Hoffer tested him again ahead of trial, his score was 99. During these sessions, Victor told Dr. Hoffer he felt no guilt because he had simply been following the devil's instructions, and that he was certain God wasn't angry with him. He expressed more remorse, oddly, for his teenage gun burglaries than for the murder of 9 people. He said he hadn't seen the devil recently but expected a visit the following February, anticipating something significant would happen then. Dr. Hoffer's final report stated he had, quote, not run across any patient that had quite as many different perceptual changes as Victor had demonstrated. He diagnosed Victor with a very serious form of paranoid schizophrenia, present for a minimum of 10 years, and concluded that, from both a legal and psychiatric standpoint, Victor had not been sane at the time of the Shell Lake massacre. The presiding judge nonetheless found sufficient grounds for trial, scheduled for the following January, because capital punishment in Canada was, as of December 1966, reserved specifically for the murder of police officers or prison guards acting in the line of duty. Victor's charges were structured as 2 counts of non-capital murder, for James and Evelyn Peterson specifically. The trial opened on January 8, 1968, at the Court of Queen's Bench in North Battleford, before Justice M.A. McPherson. Despite a snowstorm and temperatures of -10 degrees Celsius, the historic courthouse was packed, with more people waiting outside. The prosecution presented Victor's recorded confession, the blood-stained boots, the bullet casings, and the recovered rounds taken from the victims. With his actions never in serious dispute, the defense's entire strategy centered on his state of mind. Dr. Hoffer testified at length in what Victor's lawyer described as a seminar on the illness, working to help jurors understand the internal experience of paranoid schizophrenia. Hoffer explained that Victor had been, quote, doing what he had to do in terms of the delusions he was suffering at the time. That even if he retained some technical legal awareness of his actions, he was operating under what amounted to an internally compelling but entirely false set of imperatives that placed him outside ordinary moral reasoning. A second consulting psychiatrist, Dr. Donald McCarrisher, agreed that Victor did not fully grasp the nature of what he was doing in the moment. He would not have it in his mind to know it was wrong to do what he was doing at precisely the time he was doing it. The thought of wrongness just would not have crossed his mind. In closing, defense counsel acknowledged the Crown had clearly established that Victor had shot the Peterson family, but argued that any search for a coherent motive would be futile. Crown Prosecutor S. Kujawa countered that despite his recent hospitalization, Victor had been legally sane at the time of the crime, arguing his ability to later describe events in vivid detail demonstrated awareness. Justice McPherson instructed the jury that the defense of insanity applied specifically to Victor's state of mind at the moment the acts were committed, and that under Canadian Criminal Code, no person could be convicted of an offense committed while legally insane. After 3.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity on both counts. Victor showed no visible emotion as he was informed he would be immediately committed to a psychiatric facility in Prince Albert. On February 12, 1968, Saskatchewan's Deputy Health Minister announced that the facility in North Battleford was not equipped to hold Victor securely, and he was transferred to the hospital for the criminally insane in Penetanguishene, Ontario, where he would remain for over 3 decades. In 1992, journalist Peter Tadman published a book on the case and conducted several interviews with Victor while institutionalized. According to Tadman, Victor continued to report being haunted by visions of the devil and expressed no guilt over the killings. In December 2001, Victor was granted supervised access to the nearby towns of Penetanguishene, Port McNicoll, and Midland, a controversial decision since the hospital's only legal obligation was to inform local police of his movements, not the public, and certainly not the surviving Peterson family. Victor Ernest Hoffman died of cancer in custody on May 21, 2004, at age 56. He never left institutional care between his arrest and his death. Phyllis Peterson, the sole survivor pulled from beneath her sister's bodies, grew up in British Columbia with her sister Kathy and Kathy's husband Lee. In interviews conducted decades later, Phyllis said she had little to no actual memory of the night itself. There is very little that I remember of that night. I remember there being policemen around and that kind of thing, but as a child, I didn't realize what was happening. Kathy later said the family never specifically sat Phyllis down to explain what had happened. It was simply something she always seemed to know, woven into the fabric of her upbringing rather than delivered as a single devastating disclosure. Phyllis kept largely to herself growing up and took things day by day. Kathy, Lee, and Phyllis eventually moved back to the Shell Lake area to be closer to friends and extended family. And Kathy and Lee went on to have 4 more children, giving Phyllis a large, bustling household of siblings. Phyllis described her childhood overall as happy, though complicated, by the community's tendency to spoil her out of sympathy. Gifts that, she said, made her feel guilty enough that she tried to overcompensate her own siblings in turn. Kathy noted a harder edge to staying in the community as well. Rather than simply being allowed to move forward with their lives, people consistently reminded them of what had happened. But she also felt it ultimately made both her and Phyllis stronger, teaching them not to take their remaining family for granted. When Victor Hoffman died in 2004, Phyllis spoke to the Toronto Star, welcoming the news while making clear she had deliberately stopped allowing him any power over her life years earlier. I had to make a choice. Was I going to live my life or let Victor win? He took my family's lives. He's not going to take mine. The Shell Lake Massacre's 50th anniversary fell on August 15th, 2017. The Peterson family's mass grave remains at the cemetery in Shell Lake, still visited by strangers paying their respects. The 9 victims were James, 47, Evelyn, 42, Jean, 17, Mary, 13, Dorothy, 11, Pearl, 9, William, 5, Colin, 2, and baby Larry, 1. In the years since, the story has continued to surface in Canadian media, most substantially in 2023 and 2024, when Saskatchewan broadcaster Rolco Radio produced a 6-part podcast series titled The Shell Lake Massacre, hosted and produced by journalist Brittany Cafe, who grew up in the area with a personal family connection to Kathy Hill. The series drew on extensive interviews with Kathy, by then the only living member of the original Peterson family, her sister Phyllis having largely withdrawn from public retellings of the story by that point, along with archival police files and the accounts of neighbors who responded to the scene in 1967. Through these later interviews, Kathy offered something that had rarely appeared in earlier coverage of the case: compassion for the Hoffman family as well as her own. Nobody cared about them, she said. Everybody felt sorry for our family, but nobody felt sorry for them. And they were portrayed as a poor old family that didn't know anything. And that really wasn't true. You don't know what your kids are going to turn out like. Asked whether she had forgiven Victor Hoffman, Kathy answered plainly, "If you don't, you've got that hatred in you all your life. And that just ruins everything. I'm not going to let him spoil my life. He's taken enough. You're not taking any more." The old Peterson farmhouse, long vacant and repeatedly vandalized over the decades, eventually burned down. Kathy and her husband retired from farming and moved to a nearby town. As of the most recent reporting, both Kathy and Phyllis still live in the Shell Lake area, surrounded by the families they built in the decades after losing the one they were born into. Canada's approach to severe mental illness and violent crime has shifted substantially in the decades since 1967, not always in directions that have satisfied victims' families. A frequently cited modern comparison is the 2008 murder of Tim McLean aboard a Greyhound bus in Manitoba. Vince Lee, a man experiencing escalating religious psychosis consistent with paranoid schizophrenia, attacked and killed a sleeping fellow passenger, later explaining he believed he had been instructed by God that the victim represented a force of evil. Lee was found not criminally responsible and committed to a mental health facility. Unlike Victor Hoffman, however, Lee's case followed a structured path toward reintegration. Increasing privileges over time, unsupervised day passes by 2015, a legal name change in 2016, and a full unconditional discharge from the mental health system in February 2017, with no remaining legal restrictions on his ability to live independently. The contrast between the two cases, separated by 4 decades, illustrates how dramatically psychiatric release protocols and public tolerance for them have evolved. even as the underlying tension between rehabilitation and public safety remains as unresolved today as it was in the snowy courthouse in North Battleford in January 1968. The Peterson family deserves to be remembered as more than victims of Saskatchewan's worst mass murder. They were, as Kathy Hill has worked for years to make clear, a whole family. Parents who worked a farm together, children who played ball games and went berry picking. An ordinary household that existed fully and completely before it became, in a single morning, a story people tell to explain how badly things can go wrong and how rarely anyone sees it coming in time.